Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about the war in Ukraine. They assume that Russia's primary strategic objective is to occupy territory, defeat Ukrainian forces, and install a compliant government in Kyiv. On the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? That's what invasion forces typically try to accomplish. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how this conflict actually functions. Russia doesn't need to win this war in any conventional sense. It doesn't need to march into Kyiv, doesn't need to plant flags across Ukrainian territory, doesn't even need to achieve what most military planners would recognize as victory. What Russia needs is for America to keep fighting. Not directly, of course. America isn't sending troops. But America is sending something far more valuable from Moscow's perspective. Approximately $113 billion in military and economic aid as of early 2025, with bipartisan consensus forming around sustained support for years to come. Every Javelin missile, every HIMARS system, every intelligence briefing, every training program represents American resources flowing into a European theater, while other strategic priorities receive less attention, less funding, and less focus. The paradox sitting at the center of this entire conflict is that Russia's strategic position improves the longer this war continues, regardless of tactical outcomes on the battlefield. An American strategy designed to weaken Russia through sustained attrition may actually be accomplishing the opposite of its intended effect. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what this conflict actually represents at the systemic level. This is not primarily a war about Ukrainian sovereignty, Russian imperialism, or European security architecture, though all those elements are present. This is a resource diversion war, and the framework for understanding it comes from a strategic concept called strategic exhaustion theory. The basic principle is straightforward but often overlooked in conventional military analysis. In great power competition, decisive advantage often comes not from winning battles, but from forcing your adversary to expend resources in theaters that drain strategic capacity without providing proportional benefit. You make your opponent spend money, attention, political capital, and military readiness in conflicts that don't enhance their long-term competitive position. The objective is not to defeat them directly, but to create conditions where they defeat themselves through overextension. History provides the clearest template for understanding this pattern, and the case study is Soviet involvement in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan with approximately 115,000 troops, established control over major cities, and maintained military superiority over Mujahideen resistance forces for the entire duration of the conflict. By conventional military metrics, the Soviets were winning. They controlled territory, inflicted higher casualties than they suffered, and maintained air superiority throughout the occupation. But none of that mattered, because the real battle was never about Afghanistan. The United States, primarily through CIA Operation Cyclone, poured approximately $3 billion into arming, training, and sustaining Afghan resistance fighters. That $3 billion forced the Soviet Union to spend an estimated $50 billion over 10 years maintaining the occupation. More importantly, it diverted Soviet military focus, strained an already fragile economy, demoralized the military, and created political pressure that contributed to glasnost and perestroika reforms that ultimately destabilized the entire system. The war didn't defeat the Soviet Union militarily. It exhausted the Soviet Union systemically. The Mujahideen didn't need to win. They needed to keep fighting long enough for the occupation to become unsustainable. Now fast forward to today and look at the structure of the Ukraine conflict through this framework. Russia invaded with approximately 190,000 troops in February 2022. By early 2025, the war has settled into grinding attritional combat across a roughly 1,000-kilometer front line. Neither side achieves breakthrough, neither side collapses, and the conflict continues consuming resources at extraordinary rates. Western intelligence estimates suggest Russia is spending approximately $130 billion annually on the war effort, roughly 6% of Russian GDP. That sounds devastating, and most Western analysis treats it as evidence that sanctions and military aid are working to weaken Russia toward eventual collapse. But here's what that analysis misses. The United States is spending approximately $50 billion per year on Ukraine aid, which represents less than 1% of American GDP. That seems sustainable, almost trivial by comparison, but aggregate spending numbers obscure what's actually happening to American strategic capacity. Think about what happens when you dedicate $50 billion annually to a single theater. That money comes from somewhere. It doesn't appear magically in the budget. The United States is currently operating with approximately $34 trillion in federal debt, running annual deficits exceeding $5 trillion and facing interest payments on that debt approaching $1 trillion per year. Every dollar allocated to Ukraine is a dollar unavailable for domestic infrastructure, technology investment, education, healthcare, or other military priorities. More importantly, every artillery shell sent to Ukraine is an artillery shell unavailable for potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific, where the Pentagon has identified China as the primary long-term strategic threat. By 2024, American artillery production had ramped up to approximately 36,000 rounds per month. Ukraine is firing an estimated 7,000 rounds per day during active combat phases. The math is straightforward. American production capacity cannot simultaneously supply Ukraine at current consumption rates and maintain stockpiles for potential Pacific conflict. Now layer on top of that the question of American attention and political bandwidth. The United States political system has finite capacity to focus on foreign policy challenges simultaneously. Ukraine dominates headlines, congressional debates, and diplomatic effort. While American strategic attention focuses on Eastern Europe, other theaters receive correspondingly less focus. The Abraham Accords process in the Middle East, which had been reconfiguring regional dynamics, has stalled. American engagement with Southeast Asian nations nervous about Chinese expansion has become intermittent. Latin American countries facing Chinese infrastructure investment and political influence operate largely outside American strategic vision. The Indo-Pacific strategy, despite being named as the priority theater, receives rhetorical commitment but faces resource constraints when actual budget allocations occur. This is the resource diversion mechanism in action. Russia doesn't need to conquer Ukraine. Russia needs to ensure that American strategic bandwidth, military resources, and financial capacity continue flowing into a European theater that, from the perspective of long-term great power competition, represents a secondary priority compared to the Pacific. Let me walk you through exactly how this functions in practice, because the architecture is actually three separate games running simultaneously. The first game is the tactical military contest in Ukraine itself, where both sides are fighting for territory, casualties matter, and conventional military analysis applies. Russia is losing this game in the sense that it has failed to achieve rapid conquest, has suffered significant casualties, and faces a motivated, well-supplied adversary. But the first game is not the game that determines strategic outcomes. The second game is the economic attrition contest, where Western sanctions attempt to collapse Russian economy, while Russian resource exports and strategic reserves attempt to outlast Western commitment. This game is more complicated than most analysis suggests. Russian economy contracted by approximately 1% in 2022, then grew by roughly 6% in 2023, demonstrating more resilience than sanctions architects anticipated. Oil revenues, despite price caps and embargoes, continue flowing through gray market channels, alternative buyers, and creative financial mechanisms. China purchases Russian energy at discounted rates, India increases oil imports dramatically, and Turkey serves as intermediary for goods flowing in both directions. The Western sanctions coalition, while broad, is not global. Roughly half the world's population lives in countries that have declined to impose sanctions on Russia, and that proportion includes most of the developing world. The third game, the game that actually matters most, is the strategic exhaustion contest between Russia and the United States. This is where the Afghan framework becomes directly applicable. Russia is willing to accept economic pain, military casualties, and international isolation because the prize is not Ukraine. The prize is American strategic overextension. Every month this war continues represents another month of American resources flowing into a theater that doesn't advance American position in the central competition of this century, which is containing Chinese expansion in the Indo-Pacific. Think about it from Moscow's perspective. If you are Russian strategic planners in 2025, looking at the chessboard, what do you see? You see an American military that is dramatically more sophisticated than yours, with technology advantages, power projection capabilities, and alliance structures you cannot match directly. You cannot defeat America in head-to-head competition. But you don't need to. You need America to spend its advantages in places that don't matter, while your primary strategic partner, China, consolidates position in places that do. Here's a scenario that illustrates the mechanism. Imagine American military planners are wargaming potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, which intelligence assessments suggest China is preparing capability to initiate by 2027. The war game requires certain assumptions about available forces, munition stockpiles, logistics capacity, and allied support. Now, add to those assumptions the fact that American artillery shell production is allocated substantially to Ukraine, that air defense systems have been transferred to Eastern Europe, that European NATO allies have depleted their own munition stockpiles supporting Ukraine and cannot contribute meaningfully to Pacific operations, and that American strategic attention has been focused on European theater for 3 consecutive years. The war game outcome changes. Not because American military became weaker in absolute terms, but because American readiness for the priority theater has been degraded by commitments elsewhere. That degradation is the strategic objective. Russia doesn't need to win in Ukraine. Russia needs America to keep fighting in Ukraine long enough that American capacity to contest Chinese moves in the Pacific erodes to the point where Beijing calculates intervention risk has decreased to acceptable levels. Now add to this something that makes the pattern particularly significant. The longer this war continues, the more politically committed America becomes to seeing it through. Withdrawal after 3 years of support, $150 billion in aid, and repeated declarations that Ukraine must win would represent massive credibility loss, both with European allies and globally. The political cost of walking away increases with every additional aid package, creating what strategists call commitment trap. The initial decision to support Ukraine was relatively low cost, but each subsequent commitment increases the stakes, making withdrawal politically harder, regardless of whether continued support serves strategic interests. Russia doesn't need to create this trap. America creates it through its own policy process. Russian strategy simply needs to ensure the war continues long enough for the trap to fully form. There's another factor that deserves serious attention here, and it relates to how this conflict is reshaping global economic and political architecture in ways that advantage the Russia-China axis. When Western nations imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia in 2022, the intention was economic isolation that would force policy change. But sanctions of this magnitude against a major economy create unintended systemic effects. Russia was partially excluded from SWIFT, the international payment messaging system through which most global transactions flow. Russian central bank assets held in Western financial institutions were frozen, totaling approximately $300 billion. Energy exports faced embargoes and price caps. The intended effect was economic collapse. The actual effect was acceleration of financial infrastructure that bypasses Western-dominated systems. Russia and China expanded use of bilateral currency settlement, conducting trade in rubles and yuan rather than dollars. The BRICS economic coalition, previously more symbolic than functional, began developing alternative payment systems, reserve currency arrangements, and trade frameworks that operate outside Western institutional control. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system for 5 decades, began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. These are not temporary wartime expedients. These are structural changes to how the global economy operates, changes that reduce dollar dominance, decrease effectiveness of future sanctions, and shift economic gravity toward institutions where American influence is limited. Project this forward, and what you see is a scenario where the Ukraine conflict serves as catalyst for exactly the kind of multipolar financial order that China and Russia have explicitly advocated for years, but lacked sufficient motivation to build. Western sanctions provided that motivation. The war creates ongoing necessity for sanctions circumvention, which means ongoing development of alternative systems. Every month the conflict continues represents another month of infrastructure building, relationship formation, and norm establishment in this parallel financial architecture. 10 years from now, when analyzing how the dollar lost its position as unquestioned global reserve currency, the Ukraine war will likely appear as inflection point, not because of anything that happened on the battlefield, but because of the economic warfare that accompanied it. Now zoom out to the regional level and consider how this affects American alliance structures. European NATO members, particularly Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, have substantially increased defense spending in response to perceived Russian threat. That sounds like strategic success for Washington, but look at the dependency structure being created. European military capacity is being rebuilt around American systems, American intelligence, American logistics, and American security guarantees. This deepens the integration, but it also deepens European dependence on American commitment at the exact moment when American strategic focus needs to shift to the Pacific. The more Europe depends on American security architecture, the harder it becomes for America to reallocate resources to other theaters without creating alliance crisis. Russia doesn't need to defeat NATO. Russia needs to ensure that NATO requires sustained American commitment to remain credible, thereby tying down American resources and attention that cannot then be deployed elsewhere. At the global economic level, the implications cascade through energy markets, food supplies, and inflation dynamics that affect every major economy. Ukraine and Russia together account for roughly 30% of global wheat exports. The war disrupted those supplies, contributing to food price increases that drove political instability across North Africa and the Middle East. Energy prices spiked when Russian gas supplies to Europe were cut, forcing energy-intensive industries to curtail production and accelerating inflation across developed economies. Central banks responded with interest rate increases that slowed economic growth. Slower growth means reduced tax revenues, which means larger deficits, which means more pressure on debt sustainability, which means less fiscal flexibility for other priorities. The second-order effects of this conflict ripple through economic systems globally, creating fragility that compounds existing structural pressures. These aren't happening in separate boxes. They interact. Economic competition generates political tension. Political tension makes economic cooperation harder. Harder cooperation makes financial decoupling more likely. Financial decoupling increases debt pressure. Increased debt pressure reduces flexibility. The cycle reinforces itself. The structural order implications are what should concern strategists most seriously. The post-Cold War international system operated under certain assumptions. American military primacy was unquestioned. Dollar dominance was secure. Western institutions set global rules, and economic interdependence deterred major power conflict. Every one of those assumptions is being tested simultaneously. The Ukraine war demonstrates that regional powers can challenge American preferences and sustain that challenge despite sanctions, despite aid to adversaries, despite international condemnation. It demonstrates that economic interdependence does not prevent conflict, it simply changes the nature of conflict. It demonstrates that non-Western powers can build parallel institutions when Western institutions are weaponized. And most significantly, it demonstrates that American military and economic capacity, while still dominant in absolute terms, is finite when measured against the aggregate demands of maintaining global order against multiple simultaneous challenges. This doesn't mean war is inevitable in other theaters. It means the conditions that make war more likely are assembling faster than the conditions that would prevent it. China is watching extremely carefully how this plays out. Beijing's calculation about the acceptable risk level for Taiwan reunification depends heavily on assessment of American willingness and capacity to intervene. Every month, America remains committed to Ukraine. Every artillery shell sent to Europe, every strategic planning session focused on Russian containment, every congressional debate about aid packages, all of this feeds into Chinese analysis about whether America could simultaneously manage a Pacific crisis. The answer increasingly appears to be no, not without accepting unacceptable risk or cost. That perception shift is what changes Beijing's calculus. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not chaotic and unpredictable situation. What you see is very deliberate trap. A trap built not through active manipulation, but through patient observation of American tendencies and historical patterns. The United States has a documented pattern of responding to regional aggression through sustained military and economic support for allies and partners. That response is predictable. What Russia needs is for that predictable response to continue long enough that American strategic capacity becomes overstretched relative to the actual threats it faces. The war in Ukraine accomplishes that objective regardless of whether Russia gains or loses territory, regardless of casualty ratios, regardless of sanctions impact. As long as the war continues, American resources flow into a secondary theater while the primary competition in the Pacific receives insufficient attention and preparation. The real question is not whether Russia can sustain this war economically or militarily. The evidence suggests it can, at least for several more years, particularly with Chinese economic support providing pressure relief valve. The real question is whether the United States can sustain simultaneous commitment to European security, Indo-Pacific deterrence, Middle East stability, and domestic economic health while operating with massive debt loads and political polarization that makes long-term strategic planning nearly impossible. The answer to that question determines not just the outcome in Ukraine, but the shape of the international system for the next several decades. Empires do not fall overnight, they erode. And right now, the conditions for that erosion are assembling with remarkable speed. The next time you hear another aid package announced, another shipment of weapons confirmed, another declaration of unwavering support, try holding all of these things together in the same frame. Because they're not separate stories. They're different angles on the same story, the story of how a regional conflict in Eastern Europe might be remembered not for who won the battles, but for how it reshaped the global balance of power while everyone was focused on the front lines.